By the time I'd got through Biscay and down to the Canary Islands, across the Atlantic, and spent 4 months cruising through all the West Indies on $1 a day. Um, Finances were zero, and the boat was pretty much a wreck. She had been built on the cheap, let's say £400 originally. She was leaking quite badly around the cross beams and creaking and so on. Um, so I worked for 6 months with Dick Newick building the Cheers, the proa there, which I talked about last time. Um, then that gave me enough money to haul Klis out in a little island in the harbour of St. Croix and spend 3 months rebuilding her, basically. I sheathed the whole boat in epoxy and polypropylene and sealed in the crossbeams permanently so they couldn't be unbolted anymore, and made new float hatches, generally got them in much better shape, which then exhausted my money, my reserves again. So fortunately, Dick at the time was running a day charter business from the capital of St. Croix to an island about 5 miles away up to windward, Buck Island, where there was an underwater snorkel trail. It's a national park. And he had a fleet of boats sailing out there every day, taking tourists. He had his 40-foot catamaran, the II, his 36-foot trimaran, the Trice, and he had a native sloop and a motorboat. And he was doing really well and had surplus bookings. So he gave me his extra bookings, and I could take 4 guests on the Klis. And they would bring their packed lunches, and I could make $40 a day for going sailing, which was just heaven for a while. That lasted till the hurricane season, and my extended visa ran out, and so then it was time to push on into the Pacific. Yeah, this was Christian said, the capital of St. Croix. In the foreground is a native sloop, which was a rival company who were sailing out to Buck Island. The rules this is part of the United States, and the rules there is a boat doesn't have an engine. It doesn't need any skipper's ticket or any surveys or any of the formalities that you need as soon as you need an engine. And so Dick sailed all his boats except one without any engine, and we had to learn real seamanship every day, laying alongside the dock, sailing out to the mooring at night, and sailing in again in the morning. In the background is a native sloop, which the Northern Star, which was Dick's boat as well. And yeah, this is Trice, a 36-foot try, which he designed and built. I sailed on her once across to St. Thomas. It's about a 50-mile trip. And my first experience of going 18 knots across a trade wind swell, which was quite a thrill. And he has a native guy, a West Indian guy, skippering her. And that's out at Buck Island, where we went every day snorkeling and sailing. Good fun. Time came to push along, heading for Panama Canal. I had got all the charts of the Pacific Ocean off this the big American schooner that had been around the world, and so I was well set up. This is my crew on the way down to Panama. Who's Sumner was born in Panama, although he also has an American citizenship, but didn't have a passport. And his plan was to go to Panama to get his passport because it was the time of the draft, and he didn't particularly want to go and fight in Vietnam. So he came with me down to Panama, and this was our way of getting clean in the morning. The 4 or 5 knots you hang on tight. At 6 knots, it'll take your trousers off if you have any on towing behind. Had a bit of an accident on the way to Panama. We were surfing merrily down the waves once, and then the rudder suddenly went really stiff. And I looked over the stern, and the rudder blade was made of 3/8 thick aluminium alloy, which I got at the shipyard where I worked. There was the rudder blade, and the 2 dagger boards were made of that. And it had bent out sideways at about 45 degrees. So, of course, the rudder didn't work, just along the waterline. Well, obviously, electrolysis had got to it. So this was quite a serious problem. We had to, it was a lifting rudder, typically just like a normal sailing dinghy type rudder. I had to unbolt it and pull the blade off and get it into the cockpit, and then had to saw right across it with a hacksaw where it was broken, and drill a new hole and refit it 9 inches shorter. Fitting the blade was quite a trick, with the boat bouncing up and down in a seaway. I had Sumner sitting on my feet while I hung over the stern, and managed to get it in the slot and get the bolt lined up and put it together. So it was refitted 9 inches shorter, and it worked reasonably well all the way back down to New Zealand that way. Got to Panama Canal, and the question arose, how do we get through the canal? No engine, of course, but fortunately a friendly American lent me this 5-horse Johnson and gave me the petrol, and we were measured for tonnage, and we paid, I think, $3.50 US for the canal transit dues and the pilot's box lunch. Took some line handlers aboard, some American boys who were conscripted and doing their national service and just had a day off, wanted to come through the canal. Had our own pilot, and it all went like clockwork as we went through the canal. The final set of gates opening into the Pacific. What a marvel of engineering this Panama Canal is. And it was really wonderful to be able to take that shortcut instead of going around South America. Yeah, so well, my boast now is in terms of jet miles and fuel consumption, is that I made it from England to New Zealand on 5 gallons of petrol, and that was what was needed to get through the canal. On the other side, yeah, really quite peaceful, but dealing with the bureaucracy was horrible. Sumner couldn't get anywhere with getting his passport there, and with the Panamanian authorities and the nearby Ecuadorians, quite corrupt business governments, and we spent a lot of time sweating around the streets of Panama City and visiting embassies and so on. But finally got everything clear, and I had to just drop him off at a nearby island and carry on alone out to the Galapagos. The trip out there is notorious for its light winds and funny currents there, particularly as you get near the islands. And you also cross the equator at that stage. So the calculations for your sun sights all change over. The declination is, if the sun's north and you're south, it's all different. And it was quite confusing anyway. I struggled a little bit with that. But after 19 days, I made it to the Galapagos Islands. Here I had a tremendous time. This is Academy Bay, looking at the main settlement at the time, which was really quite primitive. But quickly made friends with other yachts that were there, and with a family of German pioneers who had moved there in the 1930s to escape Hitler's Germany, and had lived there ever since. And it was quite impressive to meet the kids of these people who had grown up speaking 3 or 4 different languages. There was a Belgian family there, de Roy. They had a girl of 14. She spoke her French, of course, from the Belgian, good English from talking to the scientists at the Charles Darwin Research Station, Spanish because it's the official language of Ecuador, and German because the next door neighbors were German. Homeschooled kid learning fluent in 4 languages, and has since become a very famous photographer, works for National Geographic at times. An amazing flora and fauna here. These are cactuses, giant trees, cactus trees, and I ended up spending 6 weeks here, just partying along and exploring the islands. The giant cactuses. It's golden land iguanas have a slightly different species on each island, and they're all quite tame. They just sit there until you come up close to them. And there are also the marine iguanas, which are a bit like these but black all over and look quite fearsome, although they're harmless. And they feed off seaweed on the bottom of the sea and then come out into the sun to warm up again, being cold-blooded animals. The giant tortoise is nearly extinct, but they're, thanks to the depredations of the whaling sailors and in the old days, who took hundreds of them for their meat, they found that they could be turned upside down in the hold of a ship and they would still be alive months later, poor things, and provided a steady supply of fresh meat. These were kept in the Charles Darwin Research Station now and monitored, and of course the whole place is now a nature reserve, and you have to have all kinds of permits to look around there. Blue-footed boobies. The bird life really quite tame. You can just walk up and photograph them. That's just amazing. Sea lions on the beach. A little rolling anchorage near the Plaza Islands. I never dared go swimming with them at that stage, but I see people have found recently you can quite safely do that. They won't actually attack you. But it was funny. We were waking up one morning, just lying in bed, and there was a sudden rattling of the sheet winch on deck. And I get shut outside to see what on earth was going on. And the tail of the sheet winch had fallen in the water, and there was a sea lion tugging on it, rattling the sheet winch. At this stage, I met up with a Japanese Hawaiian girl who, being an American citizen, had done a stint as a Peace Corps worker in Ecuador. And she finished her time and had come out on as a crew on a motorboat, and we sailed together around the islands for a couple of weeks before she had to fly back and head off back to the States. So had a really good time looking around. Other yachts are heading the same way, nearly all running on a shoestring, but it's quite different from nowadays, where many of the cruising yachts are really quite much bigger and much more flash, and of course much more complicated and more expensive. And the Pelicans, there's a great splash outside, and it's a pelican has landed in the water and takes off often with a fish in its mouth. This famous landmark in the Galapagos, the Pin, you can actually row underneath it and inside it in a cave in the dinghy. It's quite astonishing. They're obviously very recent volcanic origin, the islands, and really it's like almost like going to another planet, looking around there. The famous post office in Post Office Bay was set up in the days of the whaling ships. They left from the east coast of the United States, usually New Bedford and around there. Often their voyages took up to 3 or 4 years, and to send letters home, they would call in here and put the letters in a barrel on the beach, and the next homeward bound ship would take the mails. And so the yachtsmen have kept the tradition alive and tacked the names on all around, and I put my letters in there. It took 3 months to get to England, by which time my parents are getting a bit worried where another got to. For the long Pacific crossing, I took on a French boy as a crew, Didier. He'd come out from France with his brother on a 28-foot steel sloop, which was a very basic boat indeed. It was just a steel shell with a 10-horse diesel in it and a jib and a mainsail. And there was his brother and his brother's wife and a little baby on board, and Didier. They were flat broke. We met them first in Panama, where friendly Americans helped them through the canal and helped them buy some stores. By the time they got to the Galapagos, there was cabin fever on board, and Didier wanted to change ships, and I was happy to take crew. The only problem, he had no money, and his only English was, "Can you lend me $1?" That's all he knew how to say in English. So we took the rest, made an agreement that once we arrived in Tahiti, being French, he should be able to get work no trouble, and he would pay me back for his share of the keep on the cruise. So my finances were low as usual. So with the remains of my money, we bought a case of tinned tuna, 24 tins. I still had corned beef from England, and mashed potato powder, had lots and lots of that from England, and we had rice. And so our diet was corned beef and rice, and then tuna and mashed potato, then corned beef and mashed potato, and then tuna and rice. So we had flour, and we could bake cakes in the frying pan. We made birthday cakes. And we had a French-English lesson every day. So my schoolboy French was sort of workable, manageable, and as I'd been cruising, I met other French yachts and tried it out and found it worked. And really, I've always quite liked the French language, actually. I think it's quite beautiful in many ways. And yeah, we had some fun playing battleships, you know, the game where you fill in squares with the name with letters and make words and so on. Particularly, we nearly had a mutiny there where we found that G and J are pronounced differently in French and English. And yeah, but we got on fine. It was the first few days he got a bit sick. I think he was really quite scared, although he didn't say so. Looking at 3,000 miles in this tiny little boat. And we loaded up some extra water in a flexible water container from the local spring, which turned out to be bad. We couldn't drink it. And she was, at first, Klis was rather overloaded and she wouldn't surf and she was just dragging her heels and so on, till we made the decision we'd chuck this 8 gallons of water overboard. And we still had enough. We found we could get by on about 2 liters of water a day each, and no trouble. So we chucked it overboard and the Klis rose up and started surfing again. And off we went. Really good weather the whole way. The wind went light and southerly, and so used the spare boom as a bowsprit, and had the big genoa on the bow and the number 2 jib out on the end of the bowsprit. Big, about 450 square feet of sail on the 22-footer. So on 6 knots of wind, we could sail at 6 knots, and the self-steering gear worked, fortunately. It was most beautiful sailing. This is the way with very small boats crossing an ocean. You need to make time while the weather's quiet, because it's in the rough weather you get slowed down, generally speaking. Wind breezed up again, and off we go, surfing down the waves, hitting 12 knots down the waves, and back to 6 knots on the crest, sort of thing. There's the self-steering gear. That's Fred the Fourth. While I was in St. Croix, the AYRS bulletins came through about self-steering gear and introduced the horizontal pivoting vane, the flip-flop type vane, which generates a lot more power than the vertical vane. As soon as you alter course, the wind can blow the vane over flat. That pulls on the strings, and in this case, the strings were tied direct to the tiller. Not a very powerful vane, but it was good enough as long as the boat was well balanced. The only problem was that on the surfing on the waves, you would sometimes accelerate down the wave and start going faster than the wind. And the sails came aback, and poor Fred didn't know what to do with his apparent wind suddenly switching 180 degrees. It was a matter of luck whether the boat surfed straight down the wave or it would swoop round in a curve and broach one way or the other. So anyway, we didn't have much to do, so we often took the helm during the daylight hours and took turns. And on 3 occasions, we ran 180 miles in a day. That seemed to be a maximum. And did the passage 3,000 miles in 20 days, which was the same as my Atlantic run. So it wasn't just a freak to make that sort of time in this little boat. This we're into the Marquesas Islands, which are very high and mountainous and really quite remote. And the native population there was almost wiped out by the white man's diseases when they were brought here. There are ruins everywhere of old stone platforms where there used to be houses, and really just the last remnants of the culture. It's since been revived, and the carving and the language and the dancing and so on. But yeah, we met with some French people living there. There's a French woman who's married to a Marquesan guy. She was a school teacher, and we had a great time with them. Heaps of fresh fruit. You just go and pick it as it's everywhere. And for meat, they had wild cattle up in the hills, and they used to go hunting those, and they would occasionally slaughter a beast, and the whole village would gather around, and you sort of grabbed and paid for what you could, what was left over. Black sand beaches, very hot on the feet, unless you walk in the surf, the volcanic sand. I spent the local fishing methods there. The net is like a conical shape with a row of weights all around its rim, and they throw it in a very skilled way so that it spreads out and drops over a school of little fish. Yeah. walking up into the valleys there, spectacular waterfalls, and it's sort of ghostly almost, the remains of these cultures that have been uh, at that stage. The Polynesian culture really was at a low point. In recent years, they regained their knowledge of ocean navigation and navigating by the stars and the all natural signs of the ocean, and have started building replicas of their ancient canoes and voyaging around, and have realized the value of what they had lost. And much of it is lost, but much of it's being researched and revived as well. This was Taipei Valley, Taipei Valley, where there was a well-known book written in the 1800s by Herman Melville, Taipei, which described a sailor who jumped ship and went to live with the locals, and married a local, and they were cannibals at that time, and talked about the life. This is the valley where he lived, which is now all Catholic. So we moved on to Raroia. This was in the Tuamotu Islands. There are about 80 atolls in the Tuamotus, none of them more than about 10 feet above sea level, 60 feet to the top of a coconut palm. So finding them is quite tricky. But this was the island where the Kon-Tiki raft was wrecked after its voyage just after World War II. And one of its crew, Ben Danielson, wrote a book about life on this island, which was quite romantic and idyllic, and described how carefree the locals were, and how they had plenty to eat, and it was all wonderful and so on. Although they didn't have any health services or anything like that. But we decided to go and visit and see what it's like. Here we're playing pétanque, the French bowls game. Things had changed very much. In the middle of the village on the island was a French nuclear testing outpost. They were starting to test their bombs on Mororoa Atoll. And this outfit had 2 or 3 French military guys, and the generator that ran 24 hours and just disturbed the peace. And they were monitoring fallout from the tests at Mororoa, which at that stage were being tested in the atmosphere. They were hanging the bomb off a balloon and blowing it off, the theory being that the radiation would just blow away and not bother anybody. In fact, it was bothering New Zealand to South America, but I didn't know that till later. So life on the island, yeah, there were no sailing canoes left. They'd almost forgotten how to sail. Only the old guys knew how to sail. So this old guy took the helm of Klis, and we went across the lagoon to the little islet where the Kon-Tiki raft actually drifted ashore. It's tricky sailing in the lagoons there because the coral heads come right up to just an inch or 2 below the surface. And if the light's in your eyes, you can't see them. So we had a good time out fishing and gathering coconuts on this little Kon-Tiki islet. So on the way back across the lagoon, I trusted the locals to know the way they were going, but they were peering into the sunlight and couldn't see anything, and there was a sudden crash and we ran onto a coral reef, punched a hole in the bow of the cliffs, and the water started pouring in. So we made it to the beach all right, and fortunately she was a nice light boat, and straight away about 15 local guys came round, physique like this, and just picked her up and carried her up the beach and plonked her on the sand so I could patch her up and repair her. That was the islet where the Kon-Tiki was wrecked. It's typical of hundreds of little motus, as they call them, just coral islands on the reef around the atolls, right throughout the Tuamotus and throughout the South Pacific, really. Loading copra, that was their only source of income at the time. The dried coconut meat is exported and used to make coconut oil and soap and so on. And about once a month a ship would come in. Used to be a schooner, but they're still nowadays motor ships, although they're still called schooners. And onwards to Tahiti, approaching the outer reef here, and as usual, the tips of the mountains hidden in the clouds, but quite a spectacular landfall. In Tahiti, I was made welcome at the Yacht Club de Tahiti. This was several miles out of town on the lagoon shore, and it had been set up for the benefit of the French military and the French civilians, scientists working on the test site, with very nice clubhouse all thatched there. And one of the actual manager of the club there owned a trimaran. It was a Piver Nimble 30-footer. And so he came to me in Tahiti and said, come on out, come and visit. So I sailed out there and was made very welcome. And they took me out on the town and gave me steak dinners. And I got some work making awnings. You'll notice Klis has an awning over the thing there. As soon as you arrive in Tahiti, it's suddenly there's no wind and blazing sunshine, and you really need an awning. And I borrowed a hand crank sewing machine and set up in the cockpit making awnings for the other boats, and made some pocket money that way, just enough to get by, and got some work in the shipyard, working on the big American schooner and so on. So I could just get by money wise. This is typical of downtown Tahiti at the time, rushing traffic and scooters. The market there, it's since got modernized and lost much of its charm and character. Yeah. I stayed in Tahiti through the rainy season. While I was there, I did an experiment with the Klis. I'd been getting tired of answering the question, what if it capsizes? All the other yachts, you know, as yachts get together, inevitably you turn to gale stories. And I thought, yeah, what if it does capsize? Would it be possible to right a trimaran, ideally in the open sea? So I decided this was an ideal opportunity. The water's very deep, close in to the dock at Tahiti. And it's nice and warm, and there are facilities on shore. So I stripped everything out of Klis and ballasted her with sandbags. And we turned her over in the lagoon. It took 7 strong men to pull her down and flip her upside down. And I devised the method by flooding one of the floats and using the spinnaker pole as a derrick with water cans on the end of it. Unfortunately, I don't have any photos now of this. They're still in 35mm slide form, and I don't anymore have the mechanism to digitize them. But I wrote this up in the AYRS multi-hull safety study. There was one of the booklets there. And I succeeded in 2 hours of gymnastics. I managed to roll the boat back upright and bail her out and get her going. But it's not a process I would want to try in the open sea. It was really quite tricky, but this pointed to the obvious need, as she was upside down and we dove down and came up inside the hull, that you need a safety hatch in the top sides. And so my next Klis 2 trimaran had a safety hatch in the top sides, and I wrote about it in Sea Spray. And I think that was the first in the world to do that. They're now compulsory as part of your inspection for going offshore of multi-hulls. All the modern multi-hulls have a safety hatch in the top sides. And so also we were sailing these 420 dinghies. The locals had some regattas, and I was invited to helm a dinghy with a local boy crewing, and did quite well in some of the racing there. So had a great time in Tahiti. It was really fun. When we got parted out, we go over to Moorea Island. That's racing the 420s. It's wonderful when the spray's warm. You know, you can go out there in the trade winds and just plane and go for it. Great fun. Nowadays, as people do nowadays with their windsurfers, of course. Local guy had just come aboard and pick up my guitar and singing songs. It's a nice, relaxed lifestyle. Local girls, quite a mixture of races there. The French, Tahitian, and Vietnamese, and yeah, all having funs and giggles and that. Yeah, speaks for itself. Used to go out night clubbing in downtown, where the dances are put on for the benefit of the tourists. The Tahitian tamure, which is much faster than the Hawaiian hula, and a lot more sexy as well. Partying with the other yachts. This was an American yacht who just had a day sail down the lagoon, pareo party. Fun and games. the flower headdress there is the local tiare Tahiti, the flower of Tahiti, which has a wonderful scent to it. It's quite heady. When we parted out, we went across to the neighbouring island of Moorea and into Robinson's Cove, named after Albert Robinson. The Hiscocks reckoned this was the prettiest island and anchorage in the world, with the Tiger Tooth Mountain in the background. Drop a stern anchor and tie the bow to a coconut tree, and you can just step off into shallow water. Really pleasant place to blob out, take it easy. There we are in Moorea. In Raiatea, the Îles sous le Vent, the Leeward Islands, people still went to market in their sailing canoes at this stage, and they used the canoes for racing during the annual festivities at 14th of July as well. So these are single outrigger canoes, but they're tacking canoes as well. They carry the outrigger to windward one tack and leeward on the other tack. They have no jib, so going about, they have to have a guy in the bow with a paddle to get them through the eye of the wind. But they generally don't have many tacks to do. To go to market as a reach and going home as a reach, so it doesn't matter. Of course, you can see they've got the modern sprit rig. Their old pandanus mat sails, I think, were terribly inefficient and heavy and difficult when they were wet. Yes, ready about, and they get the paddle out and they wind around through the wind. Now, this was the airport control tower in Raiatea at the time. I had a bit of trouble with on my original Klis. She had twin dagger boards in the main hull side by side. The idea being to reduce the stresses on the hull and make some room so it could walk between them. And one day, one of the boards, the dagger board cases, started weeping a little bit. Now, that's funny, and I gave it a poke, and it weeped a bit more. And I got the tornado worm in the front end of the case. It had got in. I used to have rubber flaps to seal them off and stop the turbulence, and they'd come off. And through the hole where a copper tack had gone through, the worm had got in through a hole that small and eaten out the inside of the case. So I had a serious leaking problem. So I talked to the locals here, who were really friendly, and they said, "Oh, wait, we'll pull you out, no trouble." And they got the airport fire engine, which really has a very easy life most of the time, and some galvanized pipe for rollers, and we rolled Klis out onto the beach there, and I was able to repair the daggerboard cases. This was the local family who, the guy drove the fire engine, and large families, lots of kids they had there, really friendly and very helpful. Neighbouring island Tahiti, which is just near to Raiatea, all enclosed in the same lagoon. These are the kids going to school in the morning and singing their traditional paddling songs as they go by. There were no roads on this island at the time I was there, but they did have scooters, which they used to drive along up and down across the roots and the bumps and back. And there were several people with serious injuries, broken legs that hadn't been set properly and so on, from falling off their scooters. And the new phenomenon of road accidents had come even before there were roads. I believe that there are roads on the island now. It's been developed quite a lot, and it's charter tourism is huge around the islands these days. There's marinas and all kinds there now, and yeah, it's really changed a lot. And on to Bora Bora, I think one of the most beautiful islands of all in my view. It has this distinctive mountain in the middle of the island, and the volcanic island is surrounded by a lagoon, and on the lagoon, the reef, outer reef, are several smaller islands, motus. Had a really good time there. I got a day charter with some American tourists, and that gave me enough money to last a bit longer. So this is where I finally made out with a Tahitian girl, and we became friends. These local canoes are kept by the Hotel Bora Bora to take the guests out sailing, and I was able to catch a ride in one of them. It was really quite interesting. Again, they are tacking outriggers, and as I found as I went through the Pacific Islands, each island has its different distinctive pattern of outrigger and crossbeam setup. These Tahitian ones, they have a main beam which is really quite solid, and then the aft beam is very flexible, and the outrigger pitches independently of the main hull. Opposite the outrigger, the beam sticks out, but there's no second outrigger. So when the outrigger's to leeward, then the crew climb out on the windward beam and hang on tight and balance the boat that way. These boats were used in ancient times frequently for trips of 100 miles to windward against the trade winds from one island to another. And of course, they knew their way around. The French had forbidden navigation between the islands, although some of them still did it on the sly. But the lateral resistance on these, they had like a clipper bow and a deep forefoot, a U-shaped hull carved out of a log, and an enormous steering paddle that's like about 8 feet long, the blade 2 foot by 3 foot, and you hang this over the side of the boat and hang on, and you steer by moving the paddle fore and aft, and it acts like a lee board. It's jammed against the side of the hull by the leeway, and so that was the big steering oar. Here they are out sailing there, so a modified sprit rig with a vang to an enormous bumpkin out the stern. Great fun ripping across the lagoons 8, 9, 10 knots and dodging the coral heads as you go. My girlfriend in Tahiti, we made a record for the slowest circumnavigation of Tahiti ever, of Bora Bora rather. Inside the lagoon, we took 2 weeks visiting her family's land and fishing and checking on the boundaries and the coconuts and so on. And this was her house on the beach. When you need a new roof, you just get the locals round, and in a couple of days you've got a new roof made of coconut fronds. It'll last about 3 years. The walls are made of woven bamboo, and that's a life that's pretty much gone now, unfortunately. They're mostly all in concrete houses with tin roofs, which are boiling hot in the day and rather chilly at night. The thatches, wonderful insulation. A calm morning fishing around the other side of you can see the crater of the volcano there. Cleaning the fish. Great time while it lasted, but her mother there was part of the local dance group that performed for the hotel, and this was an income for them. And there was also work for the women cleaning the rooms in the hotel, chambermaid type work as well as cooking and so on, and for the men cleaning up the grounds and making the thatch and so on. So eventually, the money ran out, the visa ran out. I couldn't renew the visa. It was unfortunately time to move on. So I headed down to the Cook Islands to Aitutaki, which is a small atoll in the northern Cooks with some high ground in it. There's no proper harbour here. There's a narrow pass through the outer reef, and the current nearly always runs out of the pass. The current's generated by waves breaking over the coral reef into the lagoon and dumping water into the lagoon. So getting in is quite tricky, particularly if you haven't got an engine. Luckily, we got a fair enough wind. It's about a 5 or 6 knot current. So to get the cargo ashore, the bigger ships can't get into the wharf. They have to lie off. They can't anchor. It's too deep, so they just heave to. And they use these lighters to bring all the cargo ashore. The lights are towed by a motorboat with a diesel engine, and the motorboat at the time was leaking seriously. Locals had been using it for fishing in the lagoon, and they'd hit the coral with the propeller, damaged the stern gland. So I got myself a job patching up the motorboat and getting it running, because it was built of conventional carvel construction and with cowrie planking. So I patched up the motorboat and made enough money to get by there while I was in Aitutaki, and took the locals sailing around the lagoons. This Aitutaki sailing canoes are a proa. They're identical both ends, and the outrigger's always kept to windward, but they've got a sloop rig on them. And it worked fine because to go out fishing in the morning, you sailed on one tack, then you dropped your sails and went fishing and visited the islands, and then turn the rig around and come back with the jib on the other end, on the other tack. Really interesting hybrid of Western rig and traditional canoe. We called again many years later in Flying Carpet, and these canoes are extinct. They've gone. There isn't one left. There's hardly any memory of them now. So that's quite a rare thing we saw still there. You see, it's asymmetric canoe, and it's tilted over so that when you're flying the outrigger, the hull will be upright. Down to Rarotonga, it's the capital of the Cook Islands. Very poor harbour in here. It's just a crack in the reef, really, and the groundswell runs in. This is the out island traders coming in with a bunch of dancers on board. Every year there are big celebrations of the independence of the islands, and there are dancing competitions. Groups come from the out islands to party and dance and do their shopping. And as they're coming in, they strike up with their drums and do their dance performance on deck. It's quite a spine-tingling rhythm that comes in, and really quite interesting. British culture in Rarotonga, Girl Guides. Everyone speaks English. It's a change from French Polynesia. Yeah, quite charming and very friendly. I had quite a long time in Rarotonga, but yeah, for a while I had a job there driving a mobile shop selling hot pies, but eventually it was time to move on, and I decided to visit Tom Neal, who was a New Zealander who lived alone on a remote atoll in the Northern Cook Islands. He'd written a book called An Island to Oneself, and he'd lived by himself for many years on Suvarof Atoll. So I decided I took his mail from Rarotonga and headed up there to visit him. Well, I found the atoll the hard way by running on the reef in the middle of the night. Here was the most, I don't recommend this at all. It's the most horrible experience. I had, of course, they're quite difficult to find, the atolls, and I'd been taking sights with my sextant. I've been doubting my sextant. It's the one I bought for £5 off a mate in Barrow. And it was a brass sextant with a silver arc, so it was supposed to be quite a good one, but it didn't have a maker's name in it. Anyway, I'd taken sights at noon, and during the afternoon I'd expected to sight the island about dusk. But then there were rain squalls everywhere and poor visibility, and I didn't sight the island at dusk. So I hove to just on the jib, heading offshore as I thought, and went to bed. And about 11 o'clock there was a crash and a bang, and I was on the reef. Pitch black and rain squall, didn't know which was up and down or anything, but luckily it was high tide and she bounced upon the reef. Luckily there wasn't much swell, and she sat there. I realized eventually the tide was dropping, so there's not much I could do except make a cup of cocoa and try and get some rest till daylight. So come low tide, I carried the anchor out and planted it on the reef and lightened her as much as possible, inflated the Avon dinghy, piled everything into it I could that was heavy. And as the tide came in, we took the anchor line onto the sheet winch and graunched away on it till it was really twanging tight, and she would lift on the swell and leap forward 2 or 3 meters and then wind in a bit more, and gradually I could work her across the reef towards the edge. Then the anchor dragged home, and so I had to swim that out and drop it again. Eventually she came clear on an outgoing swell and was swept out into deep water. But then the anchor chain caught round a coral head and snagged her and held her there. And the next wave smashed her sideways against the reef and punched a great big hole in the main hull, as big as my arm. And so she drifted clear. It knocked me overboard while it did it, and I scrambled back. The anchor came clear then, and she drifted off. And as soon as I got into the cabin, it was half full of water. Luckily, the floats were undamaged, and she floated with the crossbeams just clear of the water. So nothing to do but try and sail her like that. and she would sail with the crossbeams just clear. Luckily, it was calm water. I didn't have a chart of the island, so I was hunting for the pass where you can get into the lagoon. And it took 24 hours to sail around outside the atoll and find the pass. You're going 2 or 3 knots. She was a pig to steer, a strong weather helm, and for the night I just hove to, heading offshore, and eventually found the pass and found my way in. I met up with Tom Neal, who, from the proceeds of his book, had been able to afford to go back and live on the island, afford the schooner to take him there. He looked inside the cabin and saw the water halfway up my bookcase and said, "My God, you have got a problem, haven't you?" So we cut some rollers out of palm logs and put a tackle, main sheet tackle, onto the tree ashore and tail onto the sheet winch and hauled her out. So here's an advantage of trimarans. Every year there are 2 or 3 boats smash up onto the reef like that, and keel boats generally punch a hole in themselves and sink and leave the occupant standing on the reef in whatever he's wearing. But I was able to patch up the Klis with some spare plywood and some tarry stuff that Tom had, men's leaky roofs, and made a patch in the May hull that lasted all the way down to New Zealand. I was able to, he had plenty of fresh water. The house he lived in was a hut that was built by the coast watchers in 1940 through the World War II. Each of the remote islands had New Zealand coast watchers on it, looking out for Japanese invaders and tracking ships. So he was quite comfortable there, living by himself, and he welcomed me in, and I was able to dray out all my belongings, rinse them in fresh water, and save my books and most of my stores. It took about 3 weeks patching her up and back into the tide again. Pushed off again eventually for Samoa and ran into a calm. It was 5 days, not a breath. Luckily I had plenty of books that from Tom's library. We'd done a swap and had something to read, otherwise it would have been, it was really trying, just not a breath. I was heading for Western Samoa, but I headed for the nearest land, Pango Pango in American Samoa. The stores were getting low by this time, the food was getting quite monotonous. Got into Pango Pango, and this is the famous Rainmaker Mountain. We're featured in a story of Somerset Maugham's Rain. This American schooner I met up with, Mary Celine, really friendly people on board, a middle-aged couple sailing around the world. They took young people as crew, and I was invited over for dinner and became known as the dustbin. I would eat up their surplus food, sort of thing. But we were in company all the way down to New Zealand. Beautiful ship, Murray Peterson design, all traditional rigging, no winches. Pango Harbour itself is highly polluted with a tuna cannery and really stinks. It's a disgraceful mess. But so we moved on to Apia in Western Samoa, stopped there briefly, heading westward there, just timing the arrival to for the run down to New Zealand at the end of the hurricane season. This is Robert Louis Stevenson's grave in Apia. That's where the famous writer of Treasure Island spent his last years. He had TB when he arrived there as a sick man, and died in Samoa. And he asked to be buried on the top of the hill here, and it's got his epitaph on the grave: "Here lies a sailor home from the sea, in the Huds a home from the hills." So it's quite a famous local landmark. On down to Suva, a reasonably quiet passage through the Coral Sea, and the capital of Fiji. Quite rainy here. It's on the windward side of the island. Island trading ships still motor sailing around there. I spent a month there, got some work on another boat on the slipway, just earned a bit of money, and spent time at the Royal Suva Yacht Club watching the rain come down. The market there is run by the Indian population. Back in the late 1800s, the British brought a whole lot of Indians over on indentured, not quite slavery. The deal was that they would eventually be able to go back home, but to run sugar plantations. And the Indians stayed on, and they now outnumber the native Fijians. So there is a sort of uneasy truce between the two cultures. The Indian.
No, I've got caught up on a.
Is that all right? Something. Oh, yeah, okay. But the market is fascinating with all the different fruits and vegetables, tropic fruits and things. For the last leg of the voyage down to New Zealand, I took on an American boy, Dan Heron. He also had worked for the American Peace Corps. This Peace Corps thing was really quite a wonderful thing. It was set up by John F. Kennedy, when he was president. Americans, instead of doing military service, could dedicate 2 years of their life to helping undeveloped countries overseas. And the training was started by teaching the local language wherever they were going to go. And then they went out with the locals and would teach. Often it was about most of Dan's work was building flushing toilets, which you could flush with a bucket instead of the usual latrines, which were really very unhealthy. Many of them went as teachers and did their 2 years work. And Dan had completed his 2 years in Fiji, and he had a New Zealand girlfriend, and so he wanted to get down to New Zealand. So he jumped on with me and started off by catching this Dorado, the wonderful dolphin, which fed us really well for a while. On the way out, we visited some of the out islands of Fiji, found it a very different culture from Polynesia. The language is different, the people are different, the thatch roofs are different, but they're really friendly people. And yeah, in those days you could clear customs in Suva and they didn't mind if you stopped on the way out. Nowadays, it's very strict regulations. If you do that, you're in deep trouble. They're looking out for drug smugglers, and you have to, once you clear customs from a port of entry, you have to go straight out and no stopping on the way. So pushed off for New Zealand. The passage down, actually, no photographs. I would have ruined my camera because we ran smack into a very strong trade wind, blowing a steady 25 knots, gusting 30, and huge seas. We went down to just a storm jib set and still going 5 knots with the jib sheets eased a bit and sprays bursting all over the boat, leaking a little bit from my patches around that I put on in Savarov. And the first 3 days or so of the trip down were really quite hairy. It was just a matter of hang on and keep going, but we made good time. Unfortunately, the wind eased off and we were able to get full sail up, and it fortunately stayed fair. And we ran those 1,000 miles down to New Zealand in 9 days. That was really the only passage where there was a risk of really heavy winds and nasty seas. After Biscay, it had all been trade wind sailing since then, and that was what the boat was designed for and what I was planning for. Arrived in Russell in the Bay of Islands, and the modern civilization, they had these wonderful old amphibians, the Grumman Goose, which was running a service up and down the coast and to the out islands and so on. The trees there, you'll notice the red bloom on them. They're the New Zealand Christmas tree. Its Maori name is Pohutukawa, and they have this brilliant red crimson bloom all just around Christmas time. So that really was the end of my voyaging. I had $7 in my pocket. Next week I got a job at a boat yard. It was just finishing off a yacht, lasted a week. I made $40. $1 an hour was a good pay rate at those days. Milk was 4 cents a pint. It was subsidized by the government. Its true cost was 8 cents. A meat pie was 18 cents. So on $40 you could live. And I could buy some epoxy and patch up my boat properly. So I spent the summer in New Zealand. From November 11th I arrived, and I got a job boat building with a well-known boat builder, Jim Young, down there. I was pretty much funking it as I went along, the New Zealand boat building techniques. I was never formally trained with boat building. I just had what I'd learned from my dad and what I learned working with Dick Newick and along the way. And so for 3 months, Jim was frantically building 37-foot cruising yachts and trying to export them to the States. And he was going gangbusters and had about 30 people working for him, until suddenly one day 4 of us were laid off, including myself. It was last in, first out. A week later, he was bankrupt. Turned out these boats weren't selling very well in the States, and there were some problems with them, and the order book, he'd borrowed huge amounts of money to set this venture up, and the banks had foreclosed on him. So I worked around the docks for a while on casual labouring and so on. And by this time, I'd been away from home for 3 years, and so it was time to go back. My mother had got breast cancer and had been ill, and I was a bit worried about it. And so I laid up my boat at a boatyard in Auckland in New Zealand, and got a job working a passage home to New Zealand on a passenger ship. This is before that. I happened to arrive exactly 200 years after Captain Cook arrived, and a New Zealand yachtsman had built this model of the Endeavour. It was the same length as Klis, 22 feet. It was a quarter-size model, and the men, it would sail, although it had about 5 tons of ballast in it to put it down to its marks, and going to windward, it had more or less had to be towed. But this was used to reenact the landing of Captain Cook in New Zealand, and his first visit to the Bay of Islands. So there were great ceremonials with the Maori there, and there were singing and dancing and speeches and politicians, and yeah, the Maori dancers. So this last summer in New Zealand was been 250 years since Captain Cook arrived, and this time they got a full-size replica of the Endeavour that was built in Australia, and that toured the coasts of New Zealand, visiting the places where Cook visited, and accompanied by the local sail training ships. And it's been most interesting because on a couple of the ports where they visited, they weren't welcomed. The Maori people said, no, Captain Cook murdered our chief. He's a bad man. He's not welcome at all. And look at what they brought us, diseases and money and all kinds of horrible things, and destroyed our culture and religion and so on. So there was a big talk about this, a korero, they call it in Maori, where this came to light. And there was to this particular tribe, a public apology by the Governor General of New Zealand for the things. It wasn't actually Cook, it was his men who had shot the chief in a tense standoff. Cook was on board his ship at the time, but he regretted as much as anyone that this had happened. And it's now sort of cleared the air somewhat, this reenactment of his visit. And there's a lot of talk now, of course, worldwide, of statues being pulled down, and even Cook's statue sometimes in one place is no longer welcome. So it's being stuck in a museum instead of being out in the middle of the village. And the sort of settlement of long-standing grievances actually happening in New Zealand gradually, and more racial harmony coming along. Yeah. So this is how I got back to England. I was a waiter in the aft restaurant of the Southern Cross, the last of the passenger liners. The worst job I ever had. We were working 11-hour days, 6-day weeks for about 7 weeks, and going back to England. And she was a hell ship. She had been built in Northern Ireland, and the first crew were taken out of the jails of Northern Ireland, and there'd been murders on board and protection rackets and petty officers that could act like Captain Blythe. There wasn't enough cutlery to go around. It had mostly gone overboard with the slops, and if you didn't have enough cutlery, you were logged a day's pay, and the atmosphere was really quite poisonous. But it got me back to England anyway. So that's the end of my talk here.
Give a massive round of applause to Bernard for absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. That was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
I can't really believe that you actually did it. So how did you get back to New Zealand after that? How long before you got back?
Okay. I stayed in England for a year. My parents had to move out of Fell Foot, which was the National Trust property. My father had had a long-term lease on it, but it expired at the time when he retired. He was 65. And so my aunties had a small orchard opposite their house in Field Broughton, which is about 4 miles away. And they donated it to my father, and we built a bungalow there. So I spent a year helping him build a bungalow and move out. I'd also tried writing a book. Everyone said, you must write a book, you must write a book. I got sort of part way along with it, but then kind of stuck and wasn't there. But I still couldn't see a future for myself in England. So I borrowed the money off several friends for my air ticket back to New Zealand. And on the way out, I stopped off in Bora Bora and revisited my old girlfriend there, hoping things might work out. But turns out she had a boyfriend in the French Navy who had a lot more money than I had. And, but, it couldn't work long, but I did have a very enjoyable job there for a while. I was a sailing instructor with the Club Mediterranean at Bora Bora. Yeah. We had 420 dinghies and outrigger canoes with an outboard on them. And so I was taking tourists out for picnics on the out islands and teaching sailing in the 420s and a bit bigger boat called the Caravel. That lasted 6 months until, again, the visa ran out and the club closed down for the season. So then I flew back onto New Zealand.
When you got back to New Zealand, what was your boat like? How did you survive after all that time being away from it?
Oh, very good. I laid her up at a well-known boatyard in the upper reaches of Auckland Harbour, Salthouse Brothers. They gave me free hard stand there. And I would write to John Salthouse from time to time saying, how's the boat? And he said, she's fine. And my gear all stored in a shed. And when I got back, yeah, she was a bit shabby, but I just needed a coat of paint and I could go sailing again. It's not like that anymore now. Hard stand is very expensive these days. But at that time, somebody sailing in from overseas was a bit of a novelty. I got free berthage in the marina in West Haven, Central Auckland, and lived on the boat there while I worked boat building for quite a while there and could rebuild my finances and repay the money I borrowed to fly out there.
Oh.
Yeah.
And you've never been back here?
Went back in 1989 back to England with my 2 boys just before they were 12 years old, and saw my father, and my mother had passed away then. I missed her, and yeah, my sister, and she has 2 boys the same age. So we had a great time in 1989, but then the only other time has been 2005 when my sister suddenly got cancer, and we got back just in time for the funeral, so we missed on her. So I have 2 nephews there and a brother-in-law, but we're thinking about going back home, but there are 2 factors. One was it's a matter of conscience about burning all the jet fuel. It is really serious, this climate change thing. And the other is, of course, COVID-19. I gather you guys are having a tough time over there with it breaking out. Are you allowed to go sailing now? Or what's the situation?
Anybody? I'm allowed to go sailing. Most of the people, the clubs don't have club activities, but you can take a boat out. Yeah, and they won't necessarily.
When you got back from your visit, from your trip, what sort of sailing did you do in Klis? Did you go on any other kind of minor adventures?
Yeah, I sailed around. I tried finishing the book, but didn't get anywhere, and was just hanging around there and designing the new boat. By the time I got there, I knew what I wanted. And my Klis 1 was 22 foot long and 14 foot beam. The Klis 2 is 23 feet long and 17 foot beam with open decks. So I was in the early stages of building that at a friend's house when the French were continuing this testing at Mururoa Atoll. As I say, I've been great friends with the guys working there as I came through, but I began hearing more horror stories of a huge concrete fallout shelter on one of the out islands, and the locals being herded into it and shut down and sprayed with water while the French were testing. There was fallout at quite high levels. And I was hearing about mutated fish, yellow sharks and so on, and the locals eating the fish. And in Tahiti, all the milk being poured down the drain, contaminated with cesium. And in New Zealand, the sheep were registering radioactive iodine in their thyroid glands, and it was South America as well. So there was a movement to really protest against the French for this atmospheric testing. And there was a local organizer on the radio looking for a competent navigator to take a protest boat to Mururoa. And so in a rash moment, I got my hand up for it. Found myself in charge of a 40-foot ferrocement ketch, which had been amateur built and was terribly overweight, and was bought cheap by these idealists and Quaker people to go to Mururoa, and was being fitted out with donations. And yeah, well, we eventually fitted her out and got her seaworthy, and with 4 of us, we set off from Mururoa, and out of 8 or 9 boats that set off, only 3 made it. We were one of them. And I spent 75 days at sea on the Spirit of Peace. We were very effective because we had a ham radio on board, and we had the radio operator was just brilliant. Despite the radio getting doused with salt water and smashed up, he managed to keep it running and talk to people all over the world, and it blew the cover of the French. They've been keeping it pretty much secret up to now, but just what was going on, we told the whole world about it. And eventually these protests forced the French to put the testing underground at Mururoa, which was arguably just as bad, but it delayed them a couple of years. Yeah. Also, while I was off Mururoa, I actually went back a second time and joined an old traditional Baltic sailing ship called the Free. She was 75 feet on deck, ketch rigged, with a 2-cylinder semi-diesel engine in. And by the time I joined her, she'd done 120 days at sea off Mururoa, and was almost sinking. She'd been captured by the French and released and so on. And I helped to pump her out and get back to New Zealand. And later on, I became a relief skipper on the Free on a peace voyage from New Zealand to Japan. And that's how I got to Japan and eventually met my Japanese wife. So that's, if you want, not so much technical for AYRS, but if you want another story, there's that. Perhaps more technical interest is the Flying Carpet, a biplane rigged catamaran, which I built here for my family in New Zealand, and which we still have. She's owned by a 6-way partnership now. My 2 boys and myself and their surfing mates, who all mostly have children as well now. So, yeah.
You talk about it being biplane. Do you mean it's 2 vertical wings?
Yes, 2 masts, 1 in each hull, unstayed, with wraparound sails which inflate with the air pressure, and they make quite a beautiful aerofoil. I'm on my 3rd suit of sails now after 25 years, and we got them to quite a nice shape now. Full-length battens in the sails, and the boom is a diagonal sprit, goes between the 2 halves of the sail and then pokes out of a hole in the sail at the front of the mast. And it's pulled back by what I call a snotter. Yeah, so yeah.
Do we have pictures or diagrams of it anywhere?
Yeah, well, I've got another slideshow of the building of Flying Carpet sailing to Japan.
That would be a very good idea.
My wife and boys as crew, so maybe we were talking another show in a month's time or towards winter. I'd be up to show you guys all about that.
That'd be absolutely fascinating, because there's so much interest within the UK AYRS group that into these wing sails, and I know that Charles is doing one, and there's Pete Worsley's and others, and Fred was before he was dying. So somebody who's actually got it practically working on a boat would be super.
I did publish the diagrams of the work there in the local yachting magazine.
So my question, Bernard, is on your first talk, you said you had your floats had hatches on them. So my question is, what did you store in the floats?
I stored everything in the floats. Now, this is where I disagree with Piver. It's very interesting. He said, keep your floats light to reduce the stresses on the cross beams, keep everything light. I stored the inflatable dinghy and the water cans and the kerosene and the boat hook and the extra warps and everything that didn't want went in the floats. And what it does is noticeably slow down the roll period. It increases your transverse moment of inertia enormously.
Yeah.
And what we've learned is that really the reason why catamarans have become more popular than trimarans is that survival in the open sea, if you're lying a hull to big waves, it's largely a matter of having a high moment of inertia. Big waves travel fast, and by the time they've picked up a hull and started accelerating your boat into a roll mode, the wave is gone. And so several tries have been flipped, notably Gulfstreamer years ago, and that by gigantic waves. Less so catamarans, because the huge transverse moment of inertia. And my flying carpet with the two masts, they're wooden masts and they're very heavy. She has a massive transverse moment of inertia, so I regard her as about the safest boat you can have in terms of resisting capsize by freak waves in the open sea. Yeah.
Would you, if you was in that situation, would you lie a hull or would you put out a parachute anchor type thing?
With flying carpet, we ideally put out a parachute anchor. We now have one, but coming back from Japan, we encountered a typhoon out of season, and the parachute was a terrible old thing. I'd rescued off the Rainbow Warrior. It was an ex-cargo chute, and it tangled up and broke. So just lay a hull, and she would make 1 or 2 knots of headway with the helm lashed to lee and pointing up into the wind, not quite beam on. And she was quite happy that way, as long as the sea was regular. Yeah. And after the wind had changed and we got across sea, we had one gigantic wave which smashed into the quarter of the boat, and it broke the dinghy off its davits, and we lost our flying doormat, and it broke a tiller, and it smashed the self-steering gear. It was rather nasty. But we weren't in physical danger. It was just uncomfortable and a nuisance and scary. Yeah. Yeah, the cruising catamarans are heavy ones. Most of them have a diesel in each hull now. I just have an outboard on the centerline, but it gives them massive transverse moment of inertia. And that's where their safety record comes from, really. Yeah, and how they've proved out to be better than trimarans in terms of ultimate safety.
And it's a fabulous tale, Bernard. I think we could probably publish your 2 talks. So I'd just like to say a very, very big thank you again, Bernard. And I will thank you again. If we can just say thank you and then.
It's been my pleasure. Yeah.